Good morning. Welcome to Struggles of the Spirit, a regular Wednesday morning series that I sponsor as director. I'm the Reverend Leland Udell, your host, and we're glad that you turned on this program, and I hope you enjoy it. The first half hour is a presentation from myself and our guests, and then the second half hour we encourage you to phone in and to join us here in our circle and to ask questions, to add things that you feel we left out, whatever you would like. So let me introduce our guests this morning, the Reverend Rick Callahan,
yes,
who is the pastor at Marinara Christian Church.
Yes.
The Reverend Roy Benjamin, who is the pastor at Trinity Episcopal Church in Shelburne. When we're here, the three of us today, to talk about the question, can you really help anyone to know that there are absolute values and absolute meaning in life, and also whether you can help people to find that there is a God in their life. It's at one level you might say, particularly if you're a clergyman, you might say, well, sure, you can do that. But on another level, you can say, well, I'm not so sure. God, from the Christian perspective, gives us a freedom of choice, and we are free to resist finding ultimate values and meaning if we wish, and we're free to resist God if we wish also. But there's a lot to say about this subject, so I don't know who would like to start out talking about it.
Thank you, Lee, for inviting me to be with you this excuse me, this morning. I guess the place that I would like to start is from my own personal experience, and I'd like to go back many, many years ago to when I was in college, and took a few courses in philosophy and in political science. And the question that arises in these courses for me was, what is truth? And what is the meaning of life? And people like Aristotle and Locke or Rousseau, and I was just caught up in trying to discover for me what was the meaning of life. And I hate to say this, but it was in the 50s, so it was a much easier period of life before we got into the hurricane of the 60s. But it was a philosophical question, and it was an exciting question for me to expand my own mind. When I was about 21 years old, my best friend, who had recently got married, called me one night, and he and his wife, when I arrived at their house, were in tears, crying. And their son, they had taken him to an amusement park, and he was in a little go-kart, and he stood up in the go-kart, and he flipped over and went underneath the go-kart, and he was in the hospital, and his brain was severely damaged, and we didn't know whether he was going to live or die. And we spent literally 3 days and nights, long days and nights, just trying to ask ourselves, not the philosophical question, but the real question, what is life all about? And I spent those 3 agonizing days with them. And at the end of 3 days, their child died. And then it became even more agonizing for me. could these philosophical answers that I had learned and explored in college give an answer to a real experience of life? And for me, they couldn't. There had to be another answer, and of course the answer that ultimately came to me was a theological answer rather than a philosophical question. And I think of my 35 years or so in ministry, and for me it has never been a philosophy. It has been experiential, where we the questions come from people's lives, and for me, the only answer is in the power of Jesus Christ. And I think of offhand a woman who has cancer and is in the process of dying and leaving 2 young children. Again, the only answer for me lies in a theological foundation, and that is in what Jesus Christ has done for us. So I think that for everyone, in an abstraction, we ask ourselves, what is life all about on a philosophical level? And that's kind of, as I say, fun to do. It's kind of wonderful to do and explore in your mind. But at some point in life, there are real questions that come to all of us. Questions pertaining to our own mortality, our immortality, questions to do with our own relationships with one another, questions of vocations, questions of who we love, who we respect in our lives, and so I guess that's, for an introduction, that's about what
I had a comment. I'm sure Rick may have some comments too, but my initial reaction was hearing those tragic stories of the boy who got brain damage and died. A lot of people, when that happens, say, how could God permit that to happen? There can't be a loving God if that kind of thing can happen. And a lot of people lose their faith when something like that happens. Maybe they had a religious faith before, but when that happens, then they lose it, like the popular book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People. That's a real struggle for a lot of people. And so I'm interested to see you had a positive result from that tragedy rather than a non-faith.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I think what people usually say is that it's God's will. Yes. It's God's will, and for me, I just couldn't understand that, and I think that drove me deeper into through personal experiences to try and understand how God is involved in the realities of life. And for me, I think I think of God as redeeming tragedies rather than causing tragedy.
I'm sure Rick is just
well,
itching to say something.
Yeah, well,
so
that's
please,
all right. Thank you. I've enjoyed your comments and certainly your sharing.
Can you respond to what Roy was saying, and then give us your presentation?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate your sharing and your heart, and certainly as ministers we have the very difficult assignment of speaking on behalf of and representing God and representing life and representing the will of God, in the sense that where is God in the midst of disappointment or hurt or a baby born with a defect or some kinds of crises that people find themselves in. Philip Yancey wrote a book on disappointments with God. Where is God when it hurts? And it's a fascinating book, because the reality is, if we're going to suffer in pain, what's the meaning? What's the point? What's the purpose? And if people can find purpose in their pain and find a sense of why I'm going through this and for what reason, they're willing to suffer through if in fact there is an important reason for me to endure this. But to go through it with no meaning, and to doubt God, or to come to a place of where is God when I hurt, when I'm disappointed, and because God is a spirit, and yet how can I believe in someone whom I can't see? And what's the purpose of believing in faith if the tragedy or crisis that I'm in cannot give me an indication that God is on my side or with me? And so these struggles, I think, are very common to people who have no faith, and then people who have faith. For even us, you know, when I was, thank you for inviting me here, but I think certainly the title of your program is a great title, Struggles of the Spirit. And all of us struggle with these life issues, but life is a struggle. And when we live life, we are not promised a bed of roses. We're not given an exemption from struggles and difficulties and what have you, and to try to figure it all out, to try to find our way through the maze of all of the situations of life, circumstances, it can be a very difficult thing. And so, for the reason this program exists, to speak to the audience and those of you that are out there this morning who are contemplating our discussion about the struggles of the Spirit, struggles of life, and hurt and pain and crises, and where do you go? What do you do? We just had a young child born to some wonderful parents in our congregation who was born 44 weeks with a 22-week brain, and lots of difficulty, and again, wonderful medical assistance and help. But you know, again, the idea was it's a struggle, but the indication was he's not going to make it, and scientific history said, you know, let's just write it off. But faith said, in that struggle, God can do something. And so every function that came, because there was no ability to comprehend and function of the brain, every result of function was a result of prayer. Praying in the ability to swallow, the ability to do whatever. And he is still alive today. He did have a tracheotomy and all of that, and his name is Timothy, and we'd like for everybody who believes in God to pray for Timothy. He's still struggling, but he's struggling with life, because life's a struggle. And God is in the midst of our struggle for life, regardless of how painful, confusing, how difficult of a circumstance we find ourselves. And that's the hope.
We're not alone in our struggle.
That's the hope. So, let me just respond to Pastor Roy and to you in my presentation of the sense of being here with the assignment of talking about purpose, meaning in life and all of that. And I in my own life, after 20 years of ministry, you get to understand that there are people who are viewing this morning, and those that we are recanting in our history. And I'm sure you, as a chaplain in the hospital for so many years, seeing difficult, life-threatening situations, and people grasping for breath and grasping for answers and trying to reach out for hope, for significance. And I have found out that God created all of us with a purpose. And that there's a purpose in everything that God's created, whether it's a tree, whether it's a plant, whether it's the sun, the moon, the sea, the water, whatever. God created everything with a purpose, with a meaning and a significance. And life without meaning, or life without purpose, has no meaning. And so as we struggle with life, and what is my purpose? What's my reason for being here? I think that is a worthwhile discovery and a good assignment for us to talk about today. And I'm glad to be here with you to interact and to share, because I know in my own life, when I used to work for AT&T and became...
You were a businessman.
I was a businessman, and I thought that I was certainly in my life's defining career, and loved it, loved electronics, loved to be in the communication department. and thought that that's where I would be all of my life until I became a Christian and began to serve in the church and began to be encouraged and equipped to do some lay leadership things, and then found some more tugging on my heart for Bible college and et cetera, and then found myself leaving the working world, as it were, and immersed into ministry and discovering more of the purpose of God for my life that I didn't know, that was revealed and uncovered for me as I discovered what the ongoing life's ambitions were for my wife and I and family.
But you're not suggesting that all businessmen should follow your path?
No. I think that many men and women in the business world are exactly doing that. They're doing what God's called them to do. That's their purpose. And for 8 years or so, my purpose was to be at AT&T and struggle with life there. But then the door opened for ministry, and as I pursued that, I discovered more about God's ultimate purpose for my life. And I was just thinking about the things that are created, like the camera. It's created for a purpose. The chair for a purpose. A candle. You know, the candle doesn't fulfill its purpose until somebody's lit it and it's burning, and then it feels the significance of why the candle was created. And I just, you know, in knowing the Scriptures, I know that a lot of us get discouraged with life. A lot of us feel like we've got a bum rap in life. And people are in pain and are hurting, and out of that they're asking the philosophical question. They're asking the spiritual, deeper question. Where's God in all of this? Why should I turn to Him? And where is He anyway? I find that is a very topical question that people ask all the time. So in my experience and in my own life, in the working world, in the ministry, and in my own struggles for 20 years in the ministry, trying to stay in tune with that very relevant question as I struggle in the Spirit, as I struggle with my next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Where am I going to be? What's
the purpose?
What's the purpose?
What's the meaning?
What's the meaning?
Even as a Christian, you have to ask those questions.
Exactly.
It doesn't free you up from having to struggle with that.
No.
Well, I think it's even larger than a Christian question. I think everybody struggles with what's the purpose of life. Is this all there is? And I think for me, my wife kind of jokes with me, the service that seems to be most meaningful to me and that I can really put my heart into is a funeral service, because I know that there's something beyond this life, and I think that's so important, and I don't think that's just a Christian perspective. I think humankind ask themselves, am I born and I just live a certain amount of time and then I die and that's the end of me? And I think for most people there's another dimension to their lives, and there's a connection or a relationship, and I think that's one of the uniqueness of humans, is that we can have not only that kind of physical relationship where we can touch and feel and things, but there's something beyond that. There's a sense of first of all memory, and then there's a sense of hope that relationships never die. And where does the ultimate relationship come from? It's relationship with whom we call God. And whom we believe came in the person of Jesus Christ, and that personifies that relationship to God in the person of Jesus Christ, and I just think it's the hope of life. It's the joy of life. You know, there are a lot of people that just go through life and they're not like that little boy that dies, or the woman that has cancer, that maybe they live to be 96 years old, but is that the end for them? I don't believe so. I believe there's something beyond, and it's what we call God in the person of Jesus Christ.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree.
Well, what would you two gentlemen say about someone who doesn't appear to have a religious bone in their body, you know? And I was talking with Roy. Roy drove me over here this morning, and I said, I was talking about somebody who's interested in cars, but since this is springtime in baseball, and the Red Sox are in Boston, right?
That takes real faith to believe in the Red Sox.
But there are people who they live for sports, you know, and that's what turns them on. That's what they'll know the batting averages and the how many no hit, no run games a certain pitcher has pitched. They want to go and watch baseball, or even in the neighborhood softball. That's what they live for. That's what they want to do. And I don't think most of them who are, I don't want to characterize all people interested in sports as having no interest in eternal values and meaning. I don't mean to say that, but there are some who don't have any interest except in what turns them on in life. And how do you view people like that? I'm not talking about their salvation. I'm just talking about why they're that way, you know, and is there any way to show them there's something more?
I believe that a lot of that is attributed to the exposure that they've had growing up. I think a lot of that comes with the development in our homes. People take on different shapes and theology and influences and ideologies from what their influence is in home, and then what they want to do in life. What do you want to be? It's always the question. What do you want to be when you grow up? We've got a lot of grown-ups walking around, still don't know what they want to do.
Right.
And yet there are people who are shaped in their values that come from home. One of the tragedies that we're seeing in America today is the downfall of the dysfunction in families, because people are in the struggles. And they're losing their identity, they're losing their sense of meaningful purpose and significance. I used to do some chapel services for the Red Sox organization down in Boston.
Really?
So you know, I used to take our two sons down to the Fenway, and we would have a chapel service before the ball game, and the players that were really wanting to be there, had faith and trust, or those that didn't have faith but were searching for something, would show up. And part of the question was, why are you here? You know, whether it was pray for me that I'll hit the ball or catch the ball or win the game or whatever. That seemed to be not the relevant thing that we wanted to touch on. But here are young men who making a lot of money, and they are in the height of their career, and certainly a lot of pressure, a lot of people standing in line wanting their job. So if they don't do that well, then, you know, they don't get a contract and they're out. But I was amazed to see that there was some sincere, genuine individuals who loved God, who had faith in God, and were these kinds of sport icons for our youth of America. And I was glad to see my two sons exposed to that. And as we enter into dialogue into our little chapel service there, they had real problems. They had real things. They had some had alcohol to deal with, some had relationship conflict to deal with, and some were Christians and some weren't. But the same cry was the same need. I mean, we all hurt. We all identify with pain. Good relationships, bad relationships, a good marriage, a bad marriage. Whether we go to church or not go to church, the struggles are the same, but the difference with the Christian is that he has hope in Christ, that he's not going through the struggle alone. With so many people in the world, they face struggles and they face them alone and no hope, and then they turn to answers in the world, and the world just kind of shrugs the shoulder and says, we understand, but
that's the way it is.
Where do we go?
That's the way it is.
I found that in the you know, some of the people that I met there, and I think that's true of the general populace of people looking for hope, and have somehow maybe have checked the church out, and maybe been disappointed or disillusioned or felt that it was a hollow, empty experience, and they weren't necessarily looking for a personal relationship with Christ. And that's the disappointment from a pastoral standpoint, is, you know, don't put your hope necessarily in the organization, in the institution, but in your personal relationship with Christ, and there lies our own greatest hope.
For sure. Right.
Last week I was reading someplace, and I read so many things I never remember where I read it. But I read about the latest Gallup poll in religion in this country, and I was amazed. And I think it was something like 97% of the people in this country believe in some supreme being outside of themselves.
Why?
And I think he also said that 43% go to some kind of organized service on a regular basis, which is kind of an amazing statistic for me. I guess to answer your question, I think we're all on a journey, and I sometimes think of St. Paul and at the New Testament time, and when I relate to St. Paul, his realization was that he never perfectly knew Christ. He never perfectly knew Christ. Had a personal relationship with him, but he didn't perfectly know him.
You never went fishing with him.
No, and he never. And I don't think we can ever perfectly know anyone. My wife and I like to say we've been married for 39 years, and we're still growing in our relationship. Mm-hmm. And therefore, a theological truth for me is that I never perfectly know God or know Jesus Christ. And I hope to be growing in that relationship. And relationships never stand static. They're in a sense of movement. Conversely, I believe that we can never perfectly reject God. We can never perfectly reject God. So there's no such thing as a classical philosophical atheist who 100% rejects God. Maybe he's 93% or 92%. And what we need to do is to tap into that commonality that all of us have, and to help him or her in their journey as we are on our journey. So I don't feel that uncomfortable when people talk to me about confessing some doubt in whether there is a supreme being or whether there is a God. There were days when I might even think the same thing, or at least get mad at him. Sure. I sometimes say, when we get mad at God, that's at least we're acknowledging that there is a God to be mad at.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Yeah, and God is not unhappy and displeased if you're angry with God. I mean, it's part of a relationship and the nature of a relationship. A number of years ago, I was having been a professional hospital chaplain for most of my life. I was at a convention of ostomates, which is a medical term, meaning people who have artificial openings into their body for urine or for feces. And I said to about 150 of them at the meeting I was addressing, I said, how many of you here have ever told God you didn't like your situation, that you had to get rid of waste products this way instead of natural plumbing? You had modern plumbing, and only about one or two put their hand up. And I said to them, it's perfectly okay for you to tell God that you don't like this. It doesn't mean that you're not grateful that there's some other way to cope. It doesn't mean that, but it's okay to be angry that life has turned out this way for you.
Yes.
And so many people somehow fear that God is like some powerful patriarch that will squash you if you say anything negative in his direction.
Again, I agree with you, and I think part of that comes from our ability to be transparent and honest with ourselves, honest with one another. We in our American society have learned to mask very well. We camouflage. We will share 95 or 90% of what we feel, but that extra 10% is really how you feel. So how do you really feel about things in life, in the struggles? And I think that was, Roy, what you were sharing, is that you have to sometimes you ask yourselves the deeper question. You know, on 90%, I believe that God is there in my struggle. And looking in this morning, there may be someone says, well, I believe that, you know, that God is there, and that I'm aware that He's there, but but the 10% that I'm not willing to share and be transparent, the bottom line is, you know, I'm really doubting, and I'm really not sure. And I want the individuals to know out there today that we all sometimes ask those questions, even those of us that are confident in our ministry and career and life, like the Apostle Paul is very confident of that that has been revealed to us, that God is present and that He is real in life's struggles. And He's a very present help in the time of need. And when we say, Lord, where are you? Lord, help us, that He is there and He will respond. But often He doesn't respond how we anticipate He responds, and in the methods and the ways that He comes to us are His own ways that we have to learn. But I think that today, as we open these issues and we talk about the relevance of the struggle of life and God's purpose and all of that, it is a healthy undertaking for us to dialogue and take the mask off and deal with who we are and why we are where we are. I think of Elijah in the Old Testament, who had great victories on the mountaintop of Mount Carmel.
Yes.
In the Old Testament, in the next chapter, the next verse, he's running for his life.
Absolutely.
He's under a juniper tree. He says, I've had enough. Take my life. Kill me. And there's a lot of people this morning that may be feeling suicidal or feeling difficulties. I've had it with life. I had a phone call in the office just yesterday, as a matter of fact, someone that was passing through the area, and their opening statement was with me, will you promise to help me with a good burial? And I said,
wow.
Sir, who are you, number one, and what's going on? And I could hear the pain as he started elaborating on his situation. And I'm a passerby just going through town and trying to head somewhere, but I've had enough of life. I've had enough of this. And that's a real situation as we talked. Fortunately, together we connected and networked with a pastor down in the Shelburne area, a Methodist pastor that helped out, and we were able to help this individual find some redeeming qualities in his own life, and as well found some help and some security for him. But we do need to unmask, and that's the fear. When we take the T-shirt off, when we take the mask off of who are we and what are we going to have to really deal with.
I like that very much, Rick. I mean, I think one of probably the keynotes in my own ministerial life has been to be honest and not to fear what your feelings are. I've always taught people, whatever your feelings are, they are appropriate for you. If those are really truly your feelings, that's appropriate. Maybe it's not a good thing to stay with those feelings, and I can help you try to work that out. But all feelings are legitimate. If you have them, you have them. And the only way you can deal with them is to face what they are and then to begin to work from there.
Right, because life changes. And, and the whole synopsis of change is, as life grows, as my children grew, you know, I'd love to keep them like this, you know, but as it changes, it takes on a life of its own, and it takes on a direction and a course of its own, because everything that God created has a personal destiny and purpose in life. And even as parents, you try to steer that, but God ultimately is in control of that young child's life as life changes and evolves and grows. But it's a wonderful thing to see life in that process. And I just want to encourage people this morning, if they're struggling in the spirit, they're struggling with life issues, that's okay, because life is a struggle, but it is in the process of change. It won't always be as it seems now, because hopefully, as we trust the Lord and look to God, God will be with us as we process in that change.
It's about time, I think, to invite people to phone in and to join us here, ask questions, add something that you would like to add to what we have spoken. So please just phone in on the number that you have on the screen right now, and you will interrupt us as we talk with each other, but that's the purpose of the second half hour, for us to be interrupted and for you to come and join us and to make it a foursome here. So please phone in. We await your call eagerly, even though we will continue our conversations. But as soon as we hear that you're on the line, we will pick it up, and with our speakerphone here, all three of us can talk with you. So please give us a ring. All right.
I think we discover the meaning to life on several levels, and I think our intellect is very important, but I believe it only can take us so far, and that the feeling level is so much more important. I think of Jesus's real question to all of us is, do you love me? Do you love me? And in liturgical churches this Sunday, the gospel is about Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is as we all know, is a ruler of the Jews, a scholar, a rabbi, and he comes to Jesus to ask the question, what is the meaning of life? And Jesus tells him that he must be born anew. And on a very intellectual level, Nicodemus asks, well, how do I get back into my mother's womb? And
how is that possible?
Yeah, how is that possible? But the point of it all is that, first of all, Nicodemus comes at night, and the reason he comes at night is because he wants to play it safe. You know, he really doesn't want to make that emotional feeling ultimate commitment, and he leaves confused and not really discovering the meaning of life, even though Jesus spells it out very, very clearly to him. And it's interesting that it is our belief that the Nicodemus only becomes committed in discovering the meaning of life when he's at the foot of the cross, and he sees Jesus, and he realizes how much Jesus loves him and responds with his love for Jesus. So our intellect can take us only so far, but it is ultimately our feeling and how we answer that question to Jesus, how we answer that question to anyone is do you love me? And love is that giving of oneself without counting the cost to oneself. And I can see Nicodemus, the two scenes of the security and coming in the middle of the night, not wanting anybody to know who he is, and then that same Nicodemus at the foot of the cross, where the whole world can see him, and because he's finally answering that question, do you love me, with the response of his own love, regardless of the cost to himself.
Well said.
That was definitely a struggle, wasn't it, to believe in what the truth of the message was. You must be born again. Well, what does that mean? Life tells me I've been born from my mother. You're saying be born again. What does that mean? What structure, what form does that take? Born from above, born from the Spirit, which means that we are a triune being. We are a spirit being. We live in a body. We have a soul, a mind, a will, an intellect to make decisions. And when we pass away, our soul and our body becomes of non-effect, and we are that spirit being that lives eternal, as you said earlier. And that there is life after this life, as we are taught of the Scriptures and what have you. And so I think as we struggle with life, we also have to deal with that dimension of life and death, and trying to reconcile our legacy and our life and our purpose here in life, but also keeping in mind and in view what's going to happen after we draw our last breath. And certainly there is wonderful meaning and purpose in that alone, in the restoration of our own hearts and lives. And I think of Peter, who had struggles, and I identify a lot with Peter. He's always opening mouth and inserting foot and having some real struggles, because he was a very natural man. He was a burly of a guy, and wasn't fisherman, and you know, he wasn't fresh out of the seminary.
No,
he was fresh off of the coast, and yet became a very devout believer. But as we have studied the scriptures and know that, as many of the viewers this morning may be thinking, well, you know, I've got some doubts and I've had some, you know, questions about religion or church or Christ or what have you. Well, so did he. But he was a believer, and even when he made mistakes, the Lord loved him enough to work those mistakes through. You know, when he came to a wall in his faith and a wall in his life where he couldn't get over or he couldn't get through, the Lord came to him in those times. And I think of John 21, where he came to him at the sea there and having breakfast with him after he had denied him 3 times. I don't even know the man, you know. And how bad he felt. And I believe that Jesus loved Peter just a little bit more than he loved everybody else, because Peter was feeling lower than everybody else. And so I always thought that Jesus loved everybody the same. But now I've changed that over the years, because I know that he loves those a little bit more who don't understand and can't feel that love, who maybe feel the bitter disappointment of denying the Lord, or I deny that he exists, or what have you. The Lord loves them a little bit more, because he's got to go a little bit further to restore and touch their life. And that's very important to me, because I know at times when I get down, the Lord's not down on me, but he comes to where I am to lift me up and to encourage me in my life's journey. So I pray, you know, that those out there this morning that are listening to us, and hopefully that they'll call with a question or call with a concern that they have as they struggle with the Spirit and with life issues. It's a worthwhile struggle. I used to think that, you know, so what? You know, what will be, will be. Well, yes and no. Yes and no.
But let's maybe look at that phrase, what will be, and why do you think some people pick that phrase up and somewhat live by it? Do you? Either of you?
Well, I think it's because the inability to have a firm grip on what they desire to be. I think when we have a desire for our life to turn out a certain way, or for a situation to turn around a certain way, when they are introduced to a pattern or a path that they have chosen to go down, and then it doesn't work out, there's an attitude and then a motivation, I think, that sets in, that people's motives just begin to go into a careless, I don't care attitude. So what? Whatever will be, will be. And they disconnect from the engagement of the purpose of working through. You know, they resign, they back out, they retreat, they back up from, and they just look at life circumstances and say, whatever, I don't care. Whatever will be, will be. And in some ways that's true, because God is in control. However, we can't disengage from life. We can't disconnect. We have to stay in the process of working through, because in the discovery of that process, I believe we will eventually find the will of God and some answers that will help us along life's journey.
Yeah, I like your response there. I think, excuse me, so often why people sort of have disconnected is that in one way or another they feel they have tried to do whatever they really feel that, whether it is an effort needed, and it hasn't worked out. So they don't want to try anymore. They feel burned out, tired, misunderstood, not appreciated. So they just sort of throw the whole issue away as not one they want to pursue any further, because it has been not fruitful for them, and that's sad when that happens.
Yes.
Right?
I think it's we live in an age when very few people want to take any personal responsibility for themselves and for their actions, and it's much easier to either blame it all on God or to say that God has caused a lot of things. And I think this is one of the reasons many people turn away from God. I've had, I can't tell you in my ministry, and it's so hurtful for me, how many people who have had bad experiences in their lives, husbands died and children died, who have then turned away from God because they believe that this is, again, it's God's will. And I think there's much more to it than that. I think that God's will for me is first to love us, and God's will is that all of us will be good, all of us will be healthy, and it is what we do with ourselves that taught or put a barrier between what God would will for us and what we do for ourselves. And what we need to do is to become more in harmony and to have faith in what God would have us to do. One other thing I wanted to say, which I think is important, about 15 years ago, when I was giving sermons, I came up with a phrase, a little prayer that I've been using for the last 15 years before I start sermons, and it's simply this: it's, God, I believe, help my unbelief. And I think it's so important that clergy type witness to their own struggle with God and our faith in God. And I think one of the problems that people seem to pull away from organized religion and clergy is that they feel that we have some perfect faith with God, and that we won't understand their struggle with God. And I think we need to identify, certainly to affirm our faith, but we also need to identify with the struggle. With the struggle. I mean, I've had cancer twice myself, and believe me, I struggled as much as any other person with that disease of cancer. And I can remember once the doctor wanting to send a psychiatrist in to see me, and I said, I'm struggling with as everyone else is struggling. And I think it's important for us to identify with the struggle.
One of my favorite scriptures in the Bible, it wasn't necessarily my favorite scripture a long time ago, but the older you get, and next month I'll be 46, and so we've had 46 years of struggle, is Romans chapter 8. And it says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to His purpose, which tells me and those of you viewing this morning that everything we go through and all of our struggles and all of the circumstances, that somehow God is working His will and His purpose to fulfill what it is that God wants to do through our lives. And I've become much more of a fan of this particular scripture in realizing that in cancer times and in times of total feeling like I'm abandoned by God, times where as we had a tragic situation in this past March where we had a young man coming home from work. It was a snowstorm out on the interstate, and there was a whiteout, and he had a tragic accident, went through the windshield, and in the tragic accident he died. He left a young widow and 3 small children. Well, we say, why? What's the purpose of that? And it's hard to come up with that, because I don't believe there's a why in the will of God. The will of God is the will of God, and we can't really question why that is, because we don't know, all that there is. But what we do know is that somehow in all of that which we experience, God takes somehow all of that and He works it together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose. And so whether we're on a mountaintop or under a juniper tree, Somehow God's taking all of that and shaping the character of who we are so that we can fulfill His will and purpose and plan, which we may not always know what that is, but we may have enough of direction to follow that out. And the more we follow the little that we have, the more that we need will be revealed to us. And so I know that I want to encourage people this morning that are struggling with that, as Roy was saying. You know, it's not always something you can figure out, but you just have to say, Lord, help my unbelief. I know that you are and that you exist. And the Word says that those who believe must believe that He is and that He exists and that He will reward those that diligently seek Him. And I think that's what I would like to communicate this morning as well in the struggles, is that we need to seek God. We need to seek Him in His Word. We need to seek Him out in sharing and dialogue with one another and talk about our circumstances and struggles of life, in hopes that we'll find nuggets of truth that will give us adjustment and direction and security as we begin to go on in our journeys. Because as we look to the world, we feel like that it's sinking sand. What do people have that they can really be secure in? Money. Money may be here one day, gone tomorrow.
Ask any stockbroker; they'll tell you.
Exactly. You know, what do people put their trust in when they struggle? What is there in life that in our life struggles that we can really hold on to, we can anchor ourselves into, and know that tomorrow is going to be here? And I don't know of anything other than the Lord and the comfort that He brings to us in the midst of our storms.
Rick, having worked with illness, tragedy, and death all the time for the last 30 years, you skirted around a little bit saying about God's will that I don't think you really mean to do that. That everything that happens is God's will, because then all of the, that little boy coming out of that amusement park, God wanted him to die like that.
Right.
I don't think.
No, that was not my intention.
I didn't think it was. But sometimes people are so fixated on that they very easily, and our viewers might do that, might interpret it that way.
Right.
And
my connection with that was in thought more of the widow who is left to try to figure out, well, how
what
come?
now? What now?
Why? And as we go in ministry and deal with these things, there's always the questions that pop up. Why? How come? You know, he loved God. Why so young? He had 3 children to raise.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes they aren't clear-cut answers for that, but again, God's in control.
Yeah, well, what an analogy I would use in a hospital a lot is the analogy of a parent teaching your child how to cross a street, and you take them by the hand and you show them cars and trucks come, and you don't cross when any car or truck is nearby. Even if you fell down, you have to be able to get up again before the truck or the car got there. And then the child gets older and more responsible, and then there comes the day where you let the child cross the street without crossing with them, and you just watch them, and eventually you let them cross the street without you even being there. So you make it possible that for them to be run over.
Yes.
But you don't want them to be run over. And God is the same way with us. He gives us that freedom so that disaster could happen, but He doesn't want the disaster to occur.
Right.
But I think it's important. I mean, to me, this is a teachable moment. I think of another young boy. He was about 12 years old that was on his paper route, and this drunk hit him at noontime, and he died. And people were saying, and as I say, for me, it's like putting a hand on a blackboard when you say it's God's will. And I preached I remember preaching at his funeral, and saying it was not God's will that he die. It was a drunk. It was our human sinfulness that caused his death. But God, in His sovereignty, God can redeem this situation.
Yeah.
And I think that's the nature of the cross, is the power of God's redemptive love, and that any situation is not beyond God's healing grace, even death itself.
Well, I think we've come to the point where I'd like you all to sum up. We have about 3 minutes left. If you want to, each of you want to sum up.
One of the things that I would say to our audience is that what we need to do is that people need to explore that question, the meaning of life, before the crisis of life comes to life. And I think clergy do this all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons I love being a clergy person, is that what we're doing now is what we do. And I wished and I hope and pray that more lay people would avail themselves of the opportunity of doing the same thing, to find people who want to struggle with the questions. Well, what is life all about? And to interact with them just at a time when it isn't the crisis in their life.
Yeah. Well, I thank you, Benjamin Roy, for the opportunity to get to meet you. Yeah, I understand that you're pastoring in the Shelburne area, and Lee, to see you again. I thank you for your program, Struggles of the Spirit. I know that it's being a great help to people who are viewing. Even if they choose not to call, I choose to believe that they're listening, and that they're dialing in and tuning in, and that those who need to hear, those who need to listen, are listening right now. And I pray that they will find in the meaningless time of life, that they will find a significant love from God, and to be encouraged in that. So it's a joy for me to be with you. It's a joy for me to learn from the two of you, and to encourage people to look beyond the surface, the superficiality of what life can be, and take the mask off. And if, like the writer of Ecclesiastes says, everything is vain, meaningless, what's the meaning of life? There is a meaning, and there's an importance, and that's why we're all pro-life, because every child that's given birth in the chamber of its mother has a destiny, a purpose in God. And if you're behind that camera this morning, and you're out there listening to us saying, what's my purpose? What's the meaning of life? There is a meaning. You have to connect with God and His Word, and with hope, because hope is what we all need to be encouraged by today. So I pray that everybody who is viewing this morning would have been helped, encouraged, and maybe had found a little bit of support this morning through our conversation and sharing, that it is a true thing that we struggle, but we struggle because there's life. A person who has no life has no struggle. The dead person doesn't struggle. But as long as you're alive and kicking, and as long as there is today, there's a reason to cry out to God and say, Lord, help me in my struggle. And I believe when you cry out to the Lord, He will answer and be there with you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Roy, for being here. I'm glad for this
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
I knew the two of you would pull together very well on this subject. I thought it would be a good combination, even though you didn't know each other.
Yes.
It's a subject every human being has to deal with.
Yes.
There's no way out. You deal with it by facing it or by ignoring it, but that's still dealing with it.
Yes, it is.
And that's our choice, how we want to deal with life, and whether it has meaning or purpose, or whether there is a God, and then how do we come to know that God and know that God's love. I particularly appreciate the way you both sort of addressed the subject today, and showed your own personal faith, that you're not just men of the cloth, but that you have you live in Christ. And